Imagine this scene and really try to put yourself in it. It is the year 1625.
Oh, wow. Taking us way back.
Yeah, way back. There is no internet, obviously. There is no easy global travel. And you are thousands of miles from your home. You're exhausted.
Right. You're an Italian nobleman. I mean, you're Pietro della Valle.
Exactly. You are wandering through the blistering, unforgiving deserts of what is today modern Iraq. You are just out there in the heat, your boots sinking into the dry, cracked earth.
Miles from anywhere or anyone you'd recognize.
Yeah, and suddenly you stumble upon something that absolutely stops you in your tracks. You see these massive, imposing, deserted ruins just rising out of the endless dunes like the bones of some forgotten giant.
It is an incredibly profound image to start with. I mean, Della Valle is looking at colossal piles of bricks scattered everywhere.
Just half buried under millennia of desert sand, right?
Exactly. And he bends down, picks one of these bricks up, brushes away the grit, and he sees that it is stamped with a completely alien wedge-shaped writing.
Which he couldn't possibly read.
No, absolutely not. He has no idea what he's looking at. Nobody in 1625 Europe would have known. But standing there in the dust, he was actually standing in the ashes of human civilization's very first foundational society.
The ruins of Sumer.
Yes, the cradle of it all.
Okay, let's unpack this because welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are looking at a massive stack of sources that cover both the hard, gritty archaeological history and the mystical religious beliefs of ancient Mesopotamia.
Which is a huge topic.
It really is. But our mission today isn't just to recite a dry timeline of kings or, read off a list of pottery shards.
Nobody wants a boring museum tour.
Right. We are going to intertwine the Sumerians' physical, muddy, terrifying reality with their grand cosmic worldview. We want to understand exactly how their incredibly harsh environment forced them to birth these brilliant innovations.
And how those very innovations directly shaped their gods, their epic myths, and ultimately their catastrophic downfall.
Understanding Sumer is quite literally like looking at the underlying blueprints of modern humanity.
It really is.
Yeah.
And to read those blueprints, you have to start with the physical ground they stood on. You just cannot separate the Sumerian mind from the Mesopotamian mud.
No, you really can't.
We are talking about a region that literally translates from Greek as the land between the rivers, the Tigris, and the Euphrates.
Right. Geographically, this is a flat, incredibly fertile plain spanning parts of modern-day Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria.
And the potential for agriculture there is just staggering.
But, fertile doesn't mean easy or welcoming, right? When we say a fertile crescent, I feel like people tend to picture this lush, temperate, easygoing paradise.
Like the food just falls off the trees into your hands.
Exactly. But this landscape is brutal. You have agonizing, relentless summer heat that can easily bake the moisture right out of your lungs.
The climate is generally dry and parched.
Yeah. And the wild card in this environment are those two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. They don't start in the desert.
No, they start way up north in the Taurus Mountains in modern-day Turkey. And that geographical origin is the engine of everything that happens next.
Because of the snowmelt.
Exactly. When the snow melts up in those mountains during the spring, that massive volume of water rushes down the elevation gradient into the flat plains of the south.
Gaining speed as it goes.
Right. And as it travels, it churns up and carries this incredibly fine, nutrient-packed sediment known as silt.
Which is like gold for farmers.
It really is. When the rivers finally flood the southern plains, they deposit this silt, laying down a fresh, thick layer of unbelievable agricultural fuel. That silt is the magic ingredient.
The problem, though, is the delivery system. The floods bringing that magic ingredient were completely, terrifyingly unpredictable.
Highly erratic.
Yeah. Depending on the volume of the snowmelt and the unpredictable spring rainfall, those rivers could overflow gently and give you a beautiful planting season, or
they could unleash a devastating, violent deluge.
Exactly. We are talking about walls of water that could literally wash away an entire settlement, drown your livestock, and wipe out your family in the middle of the night.
It was a landscape of extreme contrasts. You had the chaotic water, the baking sun, and the mud.
Just mud everywhere.
Mud everywhere. And if you look around this region, you quickly notice what is entirely absent. There is basically no workable stone for building.
Wait, really? No stone at all?
Virtually none in the southern plains. There are no metal ores to mine either. And there is basically no timber, because dense forests simply do not grow in that arid climate.
So what did they actually have?
You have mud, you have water, and you have reeds growing in the southern marshes. That is your entire inventory.
That's a terrible hardware store.
It's the worst. But that was all they had to build a civilization. Which makes the arrival of the Ubead people around 6500 BC so staggeringly impressive.
These were the early pioneers who migrated into these plains, right?
Yeah. They looked at this chaotic, dangerous, resource-starved environment and decided to hack it. They figured out that if you can tame that unpredictable water, you can survive.
So they started digging canals.
The very first early irrigation canals, they created levees and dikes. They managed the flow to ensure the water reached the fields without destroying them.
Turning that nutrient-rich mud into a hyper-productive agricultural powerhouse.
Exactly. And the diversity of what they managed to grow is a testament to their engineering. Once they stabilized the water supply, they weren't just scraping by on subsistence foraging anymore.
Right, I read they were cultivating vast fields of wheat and barley.
Wheat, barley, they grew sesame for oil. They planted sprawling groves of date palms, which provided vital sugars and calories.
Pomegranates and grapes, too, right?
Yes, they essentially engineered an oasis, creating a food surplus so reliable that they could finally afford to stop wandering and settle down permanently.
I was actually reading through the sources on their creation myth, and it struck me how perfectly their theology maps onto this physical reality.
It's a direct reflection.
It really is. Like, if you look at other world religions, the universe often begins with a blank void or a spark of light or a word. But in the Sumerian creation concept, the universe begins with Namu.
The primordial sea.
Yeah, Namu isn't a person or a light. Namu represents the chaotic saltwater abyss. Namu is the primeval ocean, the ultimate source of absolutely everything.
And out of that chaotic salt water of Namu emerges Ki, the goddess who personifies the fertile earth itself.
The theology is just a literal mirror of their ecology.
It absolutely is. The uncontrollable chaotic waters literally give birth to the muddy, fertile earth that sustains them. The Sumerians didn't just invent gods out of thin air.
They deified the physical forces that were dictating their daily survival.
Precisely. And because those physical forces were so violent, the resulting gods were utterly terrifying. Those rivers were unpredictable and could kill you without warning.
Consequently, their gods were envisioned as temperamental, demanding, easily angered, and prone to catastrophic outbursts.
It is such a stark contrast to ancient Egypt, for example.
Oh yeah, the Nile River. It floods almost perfectly on schedule every single year.
Right. It is gentle, it is predictable, it brings life like clockwork. And so the Egyptian gods were generally seen as more stable and benevolent.
Their vision of the afterlife was optimistic too, right? A beautiful field of reeds.
Exactly. But in Sumer, where a sudden flash flood means total annihilation, your gods are monsters of chaos.
The depth of that environmental trauma might be even more literal than we think, actually. I was looking at this compelling scientific theory regarding the flooding of the Persian Gulf.
Oh, this is a fascinating theory.
It fundamentally aligns with these chaotic water myths. So at the end of the last ice age, spanning roughly between 10,000 and 5,000 BC, global temperatures rose.
And the massive continental glaciers began to melt.
That makes sense. I mean, all that meltwater has to go somewhere, and it raises the global ocean line.
Right. And the Persian Gulf, as we look at it on a map today, was not always a body of water. During the Ice Age, it was largely a dry, incredibly fertile, low-lying river valley.
So the rivers just flowed right through it.
Yeah. The Tigris and Euphrates likely joined into one massive, sluggish river system flowing right through the center of that valley down to the Arabian Sea. It would have been an absolute paradise for early human hunter-gatherers and early farmers.
But as the sea levels relentlessly rose over centuries, the ocean water pushed inland.
That entire fertile valley was slowly, inexorably swallowed by the sea.
It was a massive generational inundation. It forced whatever populations lived there to migrate north, fleeing the rising waters and pushing them into the Mesopotamian plains where they eventually became the Sumerians.
It really was.
That sounds exactly like a slow-motion Atlantis. You have this incredibly lush, fertile paradise that gets literally swallowed by the sea over generations, and the survivors carry the trauma of that lost world with them.
It maps perfectly onto the Sumerian myth of Dilmun.
Dilmun was their mythological paradise.
Yes, the place where the gods supposedly lived and where disease and death didn't exist. Many modern archaeologists think Dilmun actually corresponds to modern-day Bahrain and the surrounding coastal areas.
Which would have been a much larger, lusher landmass before those sea levels rose and drowned it.
It is highly probable that the loss of an entire coastal homeland burned itself deeply into their cultural memory. We see the echoes of this environmental terror most explicitly in their most famous piece of literature.
The myth of the Great Flood.
Exactly. In the Sumerian tradition, the hero who survives the apocalypse is a man named Zusudra or Atrahasis in the later Akkadian versions.
He is essentially the Sumerian prototype for the biblical Noah.
He is.
The setup for this flood is what really gets me, though. It's so petty. That the supreme god of the air, the active manager of the cosmos, is a deity named Enlil. And Enlil gets annoyed.
Very annoyed.
But he doesn't get annoyed because humans are uniquely sinful or evil or morally corrupt. He gets annoyed because we are too loud.
That's right. The myth explicitly says humans were multiplying too fast and we were making such a racket on Earth that Enlil couldn't get any sleep.
So his divine managerial solution to a noise complaint is just to wipe out the entire human race with a catastrophic flood.
Enlil demands total obedience and quiet. But the human race has an advocate, another major god, Enki.
He's the god of fresh water, right?
Freshwater, wisdom, and crucially, humanity's greatest protector. He decides to go behind Enlil's back.
Yeah.
Enki can't outright defy the supreme god, so he uses a loophole.
I love this part.
He goes to the reed hut of Zusudra, and he whispers a warning, not to the man, but to the reed wall itself, knowing Zusudra is listening on the other side.
Telling the wall to tear down the house, build a massive boat, load it with the seed of all living things, and prepare for the deluge.
Exactly. It's a brilliant narrative workaround.
I have to push back a little on the psychology of this, though. Did the harsh environment make the Sumerians inherently pessimistic, doom and gloom people?
That's a fair question.
Or did they invent these incredibly chaotic, terrifying myths specifically as a coping mechanism? Think about it. If your house, your crops, and your family are washed away by a completely random flash flood, it might actually be psychologically easier to believe that a giant, angry sky god did it on purpose.
Because you were being too loud.
Yeah. Rather than accepting the terrifying truth that the universe is just random, meaningless, and indifferent to your suffering.
By personifying the chaotic forces of nature into temperamental gods with human-like emotions, the Sumerians gave themselves the illusion of agency.
Agency is a good word for it.
Right, if a river flooding is just weather, you are helpless. But if the river flooding is Enlil throwing a temper tantrum, maybe you can do something about it.
Maybe you can appease him with a sacrifice.
Maybe you can build him a grander temple. It creates a framework of negotiation with the universe.
So the environment was fundamentally chaotic. But to survive the random floods, to survive the blistering heat, the Sumerians had to get intensely, obsessively organized.
They had no choice.
And their solution to the chaos of nature was a combination of back-breaking, ceaseless manual labor paired with a powerful divine justification to keep everyone working.
Which leads us directly to how they manipulated their physical world. We established earlier they had no stone and no metal.
Just the mud and the reeds.
Exactly. To build a civilization, they had to become the absolute undisputed masters of the only materials they had. They wove reeds to create the structural frameworks of their homes.
And they packed mud into wooden molds, baking them in the relentless sun to create millions upon millions of mud bricks.
They built everything out of this. Small domestic houses, sprawling palace complexes, massive defensive city walls, and towering temple structures.
And because they were forced to adapt to this severe lack of resources, it triggered an absolute explosion of mechanical innovation, didn't it?
It absolutely did. They couldn't just brute force their way through problems with iron tools. They had to outthink the environment. They adapted the potter's wheel to mass-produce clay vessels for storing all that grain.
But then, in a leap of staggering genius, someone figured out that if you take that spinning potter's wheel, turn it on its side, and attach it to a fixed axle, you have the wagon wheel.
The transition from the potter's wheel to the wagon wheel is one of the most consequential technological leaps in human history.
It really is. Before the wheel, if you wanted to move a massive harvest of heavy barley from the fields to the central storehouse, you had to drag it on sledges.
And the friction was immense. The caloric expenditure of the draft animals and humans was astronomical.
But the wheel drastically reduced friction, exponentially increasing the amount of cargo a single ox could move. It revolutionized their logistics and their economy overnight.
And they didn't stop there. They revolutionized how they interacted with the soil itself by inventing the agricultural plow.
Allowing them to turn the earth deeper and faster, aerating the mud and planting seeds more efficiently.
They looked at the river currents and the wind and invented the sailboat to navigate the Tigris and the Euphrates, turning those dangerous waters into ancient highways for trade.
They were literally engineering their way out of starvation.
But the most vital, the most staggering engineering feat wasn't the wheel or the plow, it was the management of the water itself.
The canals?
The canals. To build, expand, and maintain these massive region-wide networks of irrigation canals, dikes, and reservoirs, you need more than just guys with shovels.
You need serious state-level organization.
You need deep bureaucratic planning, and to execute that planning, you need highly advanced mathematics to calculate land area, volume of water, and labor required.
This is where we get to the base 60 system. This absolutely blew my mind when I first dug into it.
It's one of their greatest legacies.
The Sumerians developed a mathematical system based entirely on the number 60. And the crazy thing is, thousands of years after Sumer fell to dust, that exact same system is still entirely dictating our daily lives.
It's everywhere.
When you look at your watch, there are 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. When you study geometry or navigation, there are 360 degrees in a circle.
That is a direct, unbroken lineage, straight from the muddy banks of the Euphrates.
But why 60? It feels so incredibly arbitrary to a modern mind used to a base 10 system where we just count on our 10 fingers.
It seems arbitrary until you look at the mechanics of ancient bookkeeping. It actually based on hand counting, but utilizing a much more sophisticated physical method than just holding up 10 digits.
Oh, really? How does it work?
Look at your hand. You have 4 fingers, and each of those fingers is divided into 3 distinct joints or phalanges separated by the knuckles.
Okay, yeah, I see that.
If you use your thumb as a pointer, you can tap each segment of your 4 fingers, 3 segments per finger across 4 fingers.
Yeah.
That allows you to count to 12 on a single hand, just using your thumb to track the number.
Oh, wow. I'm literally doing this right now. 1, 2, 3 on the index finger, 4, 5, 6 on the middle finger, 7, 8, 9 on the ring finger, 10, 11, 12 on the pinky.
Okay, yeah, that is incredibly tactile.
It is. Now you hold that 12 on one hand, you have 5 digits, 4 fingers, and a thumb on your other hand.
Okay, got it. Each time you reach 12 on your counting hand, you raise 1 digit on your opposite hand. 5 digits multiplied by the 12 segments equals 60. You can count to 60 on your 2 hands without ever losing your place.
That is genuinely brilliant.
Furthermore, mathematically, 60 is what we call a highly composite number. Think about the prime factorization. 60 can be divided cleanly without any messy fractions or remainders by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30.
Which is a lifesaver if you don't have calculators. If you have 10 items, you can't easily divide them among 3 people. You get 3.333 repeating. But 60 divides by 3 beautifully. It divides by 4 beautifully.
Exactly. If you are a Sumerian bureaucrat tasked with dividing massive grain rations among thousands of specialized workers or calculating the slope of a canal over miles of terrain, having a mathematical base that divides so cleanly into so many whole numbers is an incredible tool for efficiency.
So you have these people doing complex geometry. They're out there digging miles of irrigation canals by hand in 115-degree heat. They are hauling heavy mud bricks from dawn to dusk.
It's grueling work.
It begs a massive question. Why did the average Sumerian agree to do this? How do you motivate tens of thousands of people to submit to this back-breaking, endless labor without them just dropping their tools and walking away into the desert?
You give them a cosmic purpose.
Hmm.
You convince them that their labor is not just for the enrichment of the king, but that it is the fundamental reason they exist.
The ultimate motivation.
Exactly. The Sumerians integrated this concept of endless labor directly into the core of their creation myth. In their mythology, long before humans were ever formed, there was a class of lesser working-class gods known as the Igigi.
The divine middle management, basically.
Precisely. The high gods, the executives like Anu the sky god, and Lil the manager, and Enki the engineer, forced the Igigi to do all the heavy cosmic lifting.
So the gods were doing manual labor.
According to the myth, the Igigi were the ones out there digging the rivers of the universe, clearing the divine canals, and building the infrastructure of reality.
And just like any overworked, underpaid, exhausted labor force, the Igigi eventually snapped.
They organized a divine labor strike.
The myth says they literally set fire to their tools, threw their spades into the flames, marched up to Enlil's grand palace, surrounded it, and essentially said, "We're done. We refuse to dig another ditch. You can run the universe yourselves."
Which immediately triggers a cosmic supply chain crisis. The universe was grinding to a halt, the canals were silting up, the divine food wasn't being grown.
So what did the high gods do?
So the mother goddess, Ninmah, realizes the catastrophe and goes to Enki. Enki is often depicted in these myths as sleeping through the chaos or just being incredibly clever and aloof.
Typical Anki.
Ninma wakes him up and says, "We need a solution immediately. The Igigi are rioting. We need a substitute workforce to carry the yoke of the gods."
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Enki, the god of wisdom, says, I've got an idea. He and Ninma go down to the fertile riverbank. They scoop up the clay, the literal ubiquitous mud of Mesopotamia.
They shape it, they bind it with the blood of a slain rebel god to give it a soul, and they breathe life into it. They create humanity.
But here's the critical part. They didn't create humans to be the crown jewel of the universe. They didn't put us in a garden to name the animals and enjoy the beauty of creation.
No, not at all.
They created humans explicitly, solely, and unapologetically to be a substitute labor force for the gods.
The psychological weight of that worldview is staggering. The Sumerians did not suffer from anthropocentrism. They did not view humanity as the main characters of the cosmic drama.
They saw themselves as indentured servants to a vast, indifferent divine bureaucracy.
Their literal fundamental purpose for drawing breath on Earth was to produce resources, grow food, dig canals, and build grand temples for their divine bosses.
I look at this origin story and I immediately think of how we treat modern artificial intelligence.
Oh, that's a fascinating comparison.
Think about it. We are inventing AI, machine learning, and robotics right now to do our grunt work. We want AI to automate our supply chains, to crunch our endless data, to write our code so we don't have to.
We are creating an intelligence purely to serve our economic needs and increase our leisure.
In the Sumerian mind, the gods basically invented us to be their AI. We were the organic robots created to automate the cosmic supply chain so the high gods could relax.
That analogy holds up incredibly well. And just as our modern development of AI is causing a massive, rapid technological explosion today, the Sumerians' belief that they were divinely mandated to be hyperproductive fueled their rapid technological progress.
Because if your literal purpose on Earth is to produce resources for the gods, then inefficiency isn't just an annoyance. Inefficiency is a profound sin.
Laziness is a cosmic crime that will draw the wrath of Enlil.
Exactly. They believed they were ethically bound to produce. And to be clear, it wasn't just mindless, brutal slavery, right?
No, they genuinely believed that alongside hard work, ethical conduct, protecting the weak, ensuring justice, not using false weights to cheat people in the marketplace, please the gods.
But the core driver of their society was agricultural and material production.
They had to be efficient. So they invented the tools, the math, and the organization to maximize that efficiency. And with humanity put to work under this relentless divine mandate, those small farming villages began to snowball.
The sheer volume of food and people forced a societal evolution into something the world had never seen before. The mega city.
Right, because you have this divine mandate forcing tens of thousands of people to work at maximum efficiency. But when you pack that much hyperproductive labor into one small area, the village model completely breaks down.
You accidentally invent the metropolis.
We trace the rise of these first true cities back to places like Eridu around 5400 BC. But the absolute crown jewel, the New York City of the ancient world, was Uruk.
Uruk was massive. By around 3500 BC, Uruk was this huge, walled metropolis home to anywhere from 40,000 to 80,000 people.
It's a density of human habitation that was completely unprecedented in the history of the species.
When you pack that many human beings behind a wall, and they are generating massive region-wide agricultural surpluses, you run into an insurmountable data management problem.
You have to track who grew the barley, who brought the sheep, who owes taxes to the temple, and how many daily rations of grain and beer you need to pay the laborers digging the new canal.
The human brain simply cannot hold that much numerical data. Memory fails.
The economic complexity outgrew their biology. And so, around 3200 BC, out of pure administrative desperation, they invent the ultimate information technology, writing.
Historically and archaeologically, we can trace how this happened. It didn't start as poetry.
No, it started with simple accounting. First, they used little clay tokens shaped like sheep or jars of oil. Then they started sealing those tokens inside hollow clay balls called bullae.
But eventually, some brilliant administrator realized you didn't need the tokens at all, right?
Exactly. You could just draw a picture of a sheep on the outside of a flat clay tablet using a sharpened reed. These were early pictographs.
But drawing detailed pictures of sheep and grain stalks in wet clay is slow and tedious, especially when you have a line of 1,000 workers waiting for their rations.
Precisely. So over centuries, those literal pictures evolved. Scribes realized that instead of drawing curves, which is hard and wet clay, they could just press the triangular tip of a reed stylus directly into the clay, leaving a wedge-shaped impression.
And cuneiform literally means wedge-shaped.
It does. They started combining these abstract wedges to represent syllables, sounds, and eventually complex abstract concepts. It shifted from simple accounting to a versatile technology capable of recording actual literature, law, and history.
I love that they have a myth for this invention, too. The Sumerians couldn't just accept that a bored accountant invented writing over 1,000 years. They needed a cool origin story.
They always have a great myth.
In their mythology, there is a legendary king of Uruk named Enmerkar. And Enmerkar is locked in this tense geopolitical standoff with a rival king in a distant, wealthy city called Urartu.
And Merkar keeps sending his royal messenger back and forth across the mountains with these increasingly complex, layered, threatening messages demanding tribute.
And eventually, the message gets so long, so legally complicated, and so full of threats that the poor messenger's brain just breaks. He literally cannot memorize the speech.
According to the epic poem, King Enmerkar gets immensely frustrated with the limitations of human memory. He grabs a handful of wet clay, flattens it out, invents cuneiform writing completely on the spot, and presses his words into the clay.
Just like that.
The myth says, before that time, writing on clay had not yet existed, but now, when the sun rose, it was so. It is a charming, dramatic story.
But it reflects a deep historical truth. Writing was born out of the absolute necessity to manage complexity, convey exact information, and exert royal power over vast distances.
I look at the evolution of cuneiform almost like how we evolved emojis into complex digital communication.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
We started by sending a little smiley face, a literal pictograph, and eventually we developed an entire digital lexicon to convey complex tone and abstract thought. The Sumerians were doing the exact same thing with wedges of mud.
And alongside this information revolution, Uruk was experiencing a full-blown industrial revolution. They stopped making beautiful, ornate, hand-painted pottery on slow wheels.
The focus shifted entirely to mass production.
They started churning out millions of plain, utilitarian, identical beveled rim bowls on fast wheels just to distribute the daily grain rations to the working class.
The scale of this industrialization is hard to overstate. We have extensive archaeological evidence from Sumerian cities, particularly from places like Dursu, showing massive state-run workshops.
These weren't quaint little village huts with a single loom.
No, these were massive complexes where thousands of women and children were employed, often in debt peonage or as captives of war, weaving textiles from dawn to dusk.
They were processing wool from flocks of sheep numbering in the hundreds of thousands. This was ancient industrialization. Scale, volume, and efficiency became the only metrics that mattered.
But this industrial scale brought a massive amount of societal baggage. And what I find so fascinating is that the Sumerians were incredibly self-aware about the dark side of civilization.
They didn't just blindly celebrate their massive cities, they knew the cost.
This deep ambivalence about urban life is perfectly embodied in the patron goddess of Uruk, Inanna, who becomes known later as Ishtar.
Inanna is arguably the most complex, fascinating deity in human history. She is a goddess of contradictions.
She's the goddess of love, physical beauty, and sexual prowess. But she is simultaneously the goddess of war, political ambition, and terrifying destruction. She is fiercely independent, often defying the older male gods.
There is this fantastic myth that perfectly illustrates her nature and how the Sumerians viewed civilization. Inanna wants to elevate her city of Uruk to be the greatest in the world.
So she travels down to the watery domain of Enki, the god of wisdom, who possesses the me pronounced meh.
The me are essentially the divine blueprints, the foundational concepts, or the source code of all the aspects of civilization.
She sits down with Enki, they start drinking beer, and she basically gets him incredibly blackout drunk.
While he is completely wasted, she tricks him into gifting her all the me, loads them onto her boat of heaven, and sails back to Uruk.
And what is vital to understand is exactly what those me consisted of. Yes, she took the me for beautiful things. She took the blueprints for art, for music, for law, for writing, for the priesthood, and for monumental temple building.
But the myth explicitly states she also took the me for prostitution, for deceit, for fear, for the destruction of cities, and for social strife.
They knew. That blows my mind.
Yeah.
They fundamentally understood that you cannot have the glory of a massive city without the brutality that inevitably comes with it.
You can't have monumental architecture and vast wealth without creating social inequality, crime, and a desperate underclass. Inanna bringing all the me to Uruk is their way of saying civilization is a package deal. You get the writing and the art, but you also get the war and the deceit.
We see this exact tension explored perfectly in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the legendary mythological king of Uruk. He is part god, part man, and he's credited with building the magnificent, towering defensive walls of Uruk.
But at the beginning of the epic, he is an absolute tyrant. He represents the worst abuses of urban power. He is abusing his people, claiming the right of first night with brides, and forcing the men to labor endlessly on his vanity projects.
The people are suffering so much under this forced urbanization that they pray to the gods for relief. The gods respond by creating Enkidu, a hairy, wild man of the steppe who runs with the animals.
Enkidu represents the pure, untamed, natural world before civilization.
He is brought into the city, he wrestles Gilgamesh, they fight to a standstill, and they become best friends. They go on these incredible adventures slaying monsters.
But eventually, Enkidu angers the gods and falls ill and dies. And Gilgamesh is forced to confront the absolute, terrifying reality of human mortality.
The king who built the greatest city on earth is brought to his knees by grief and the fear of death, sending him on a desperate, ultimately doomed quest for immortality. It's a profound story about the limits of human power.
Hearing about the tyranny of Gilgamesh makes me want to push back on this whole glory of Uruk narrative that we get in history books.
How do you mean?
We look back, we see the museums full of golden jewelry, we marvel at the ruins of their ziggurats and the invention of writing, we celebrate it. But if you were an average working-class person in Uruk around 3500 BC, you were likely being paid in meager subsistence barley rations doled out in those mass-produced bowls.
You were working from dawn to dusk, hauling mud bricks in the sweltering heat, or weaving wool until your fingers bled.
Your city relied heavily on slave labor captives taken from the hill regions. Honestly, if we look at it objectively, wasn't the invention of civilization actually a massive downgrade in your daily quality of life compared to being a free-roaming, relatively egalitarian hunter-gatherer?
You are hitting on the eternal paradox of civilization. From a purely biological and immediate quality of life standpoint, anthropologists generally agree that for the bottom 90% of the population, the transition to early urbanization was a severe downgrade.
It had to be.
It likely meant more communicable diseases because you were living in dense squalor. It meant worse nutrition because your diet narrowed to just grain compared to the very diet of a forager. And it meant submitting to a rigid, often brutal hierarchy that entirely restricted your freedom.
So why do it? Why stay?
Because you traded that autonomy for security. Outside the city walls, you were vulnerable to the raiders, the lions, and the unpredictable floods.
But inside the walls of Uruk, you had the protection of the king's army, and you had a guaranteed, albeit meager, ration of grain from the temple storehouses, even during a drought.
It was a brutal bargain, but one that humans continuously chose to make.
So you have these massive cities growing incredibly wealthy at the top, packing in more people and demanding exponentially more resources just to function. The farmland can only produce so much. What happens when these city-states run out of room and resources?
They are forced to turn outward. Because the Sumerians were fundamentally resource poor in everything except mud and grain, international trade was not a luxury, it was a matter of absolute survival.
They took their massive agricultural surplus, their grain, their dried fish, and especially their mass-produced textiles from places like Girsu, and they built a staggering, complex global trade network.
Calling it global really isn't an exaggeration for the Bronze Age. We are talking about logistics that seem impossible without modern technology.
They were trading north, deep into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, to acquire the timber and heavy stone they desperately needed for building.
They were trading far east into the mountains of Iran and Afghanistan for precious gems like lapis lazuli.
They were even building large reed and wood ships to sail all the way down the Persian Gulf to trade with the Indus Valley civilization in modern-day India for carnelian and exotic animals.
The wealth this trade generated flowing back into cities like Ur and Uruk was astronomical. And we could see this incredible wealth and the social stratification it caused, perfectly preserved in an artifact known as the Standard of Ur.
This was discovered in the royal tombs of the city of Ur. It is a hollow wooden box, likely the sounding box of a musical instrument, and it is completely inlaid with an intricate, breathtaking mosaic made of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, red limestone from India, and white shell from the Persian Gulf.
The materials themselves are a map of their trade routes.
I've seen pictures of this, and it's basically an ancient comic book. It tells a complete story in registers, or rows.
Exactly. And the story it tells is the dual nature of Sumerian society. It has two distinct sides. One side is referred to as the peace panel.
The bottom rows show the commoners bringing the agricultural bounty, carrying sacks of grain, leading fat sheep and cattle.
The top row shows the elite, the king and his nobles, seated on chairs drinking beer or wine to the sound of a musician playing a lyre. It depicts a harmonious, hyper-prosperous, rigidly hierarchical society at peace.
But then you flip the box over and you see the cost of that peace. The other side is the war panel.
It depicts heavy, four-wheeled chariots drawn by wild asses, physically trampling over the bloody bodies of their enemies.
You see ranks of infantry in standardized armor holding spears. And on the top row, you see naked, bound captives being led away to be enslaved by the king.
It is the absolute visual representation of Inanna's dual nature: peace, music, and prosperity on one side, brutal mechanized conquest on the other.
And as these city-states expanded their agricultural footprint, they inevitably started bumping into each other. The fertile land and the vital irrigation water rights between neighboring cities became hotly contested.
We see a definitive shift in the archaeological record, from peaceful, long-distance trade to highly organized, violent competition between the Sumerians themselves.
The most famous evidence of this violent shift is the Stele of the Vultures. This is a massive stone monument commemorating a bitter, bloody, multi-generational border war over a patch of fertile land between the rival city-states of Lagash and Umma around 2500 BC.
And the imagery carved into this stele is not subtle. It is incredibly graphic and designed to inspire terror.
It shows Eanadam, the king of Lagash, leading a phalanx of heavily armed soldiers. These men are marching in a tight, disciplined formation, their shields interlocked to form a solid wall, their long spears protruding forward.
And they are literally marching over the trampled, severed, naked bodies of their enemies from Umma. It is a carpet of corpses under their sandals.
And above this phalanx, the carving shows a flock of vultures flying away, carrying the severed heads and limbs of the Umma soldiers in their beaks.
The psychological terror of facing an organized, armored phalanx like that for the first time in human history must have been paralyzing. This isn't just a border skirmish between farmers with pitchforks. This is state-level, organized, industrialized slaughter.
But this endless, bloody infighting over borders and water left the Sumerian city-states incredibly vulnerable. They were immensely wealthy, but they were deeply divided and constantly depleting their own manpower.
They created the perfect geopolitical power vacuum for a charismatic outsider to exploit. Enter Sargon of Akkad.
Sargon. If there is a main character of early Mesopotamian history, it is this guy. He emerges around the 24th century BC, and his origin story is incredible. It is quite literally the blueprint for the biblical Moses story, written centuries earlier.
According to his own propagandistic legends, Sargon was born in secret to a high priestess. To hide his birth, she placed him in a woven reed basket, sealed the cracks with pitch, and set him adrift on the Euphrates River.
The legend continues that the basket floated downstream and was found by a humble royal gardener named Aki, who drew him out of the water and raised him as a commoner.
As a young man, Sargon managed to secure a position at the court of the king of Kish, eventually rising to the highly trusted position of cupbearer.
And from that position of intimate trust, Sargon launches a coup. He overthrows the king of Kish, seizes power for himself, and then does something entirely unprecedented in Mesopotamian history.
He didn't just want to defeat a rival city to settle a border dispute. He wanted to conquer all of them. He wanted to own the world.
He launched a massive surprise attack on Uruk, defeated their powerful king, and then systematically marched his armies south, conquering all the major independent Sumerian city-states one by one.
By doing this, he established the Akkadian Empire, what most historians consider the world's first true empire.
And his tactics for maintaining this empire were brutal, but highly effective. To prevent the conquered cities from rebelling, Sargon systematically dismantled and physically tore down the massive defensive walls of the Sumerian cities.
He left them entirely defenseless against his standing army. But his most effective weapon was cultural imperialism. He forced the Akkadian language, which was a Semitic language, completely distinct and unrelated to the Sumerian language, onto the conquered administrative state.
Akkadians were placed in all the top administrative, military, and religious posts across Sumer.
This raises a huge question about how ancient people understood the concept of political power. Why did the Sumerian people accept Sargon even reluctantly? He was a foreigner, he spoke a different language, and he tore down their walls.
It comes back to how they viewed the gods. The Sumerians firmly believed that kingship was not a human invention. It was a divine institution that was literally lowered from heaven.
And the god who possessed the authority to grant that kingship was Enlil, the supreme manager of the cosmos.
We see this theological justification perfectly illustrated in the Sumerian king list. This is a fascinating, complex, ancient document that meticulously blends hard, verifiable historical facts with impossibly long mythological reigns.
It lists mythical kings who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years before the Great Flood, and then seamlessly transitions to listing historical kings we know from archaeological evidence actually existed.
The entire purpose of the document was political propaganda. It was designed to show that there was only one true seat of power, and whoever currently holds the throne has the unbroken divine mandate handed down directly from Enlil.
So when Sargon, a foreigner, violently conquered Sumer, the theological explanation the priest provided to the confused masses was simply that Enlil had grown tired of the Sumerian kings.
Enlil had withdrawn his divine favor from Uruk and handed the mandate of heaven to Sargon. The gods authorized the dictator.
But as the Sumerians knew all too well, divine favor is incredibly fickle. And Sargon's grandson, a powerful king named Naram-Sin, found this out the hard way.
Historically, Naram-Sin was a brilliant military commander who expanded the Akkadian Empire to its absolute territorial peak. He pushed deep into foreign lands.
He became so powerful and wealthy that he did something incredibly audacious. He declared himself a living god, having himself depicted wearing the horned helmet of divinity. But his reign was also plagued by massive, terrifying, widespread rebellions across the empire.
The empire was beginning to fracture under its own weight, and later Mesopotamian generations looked back at Naram-Sin's turbulent, violent reign and created a powerful myth to explain why the golden age of Akkad began to fall apart.
The myth is called the Curse of Akkad. According to the story, Naram-Sin, believing his own hype as a living god, committed the ultimate act of hubris. He demanded a favorable oracle from Enlil to launch a new campaign.
When Enlil remained silent and refused to give the blessing, Naram-Sin flew into a blasphemous rage. He marched his army into the holy city of Nippur, the religious capital, and physically destroyed Enlil's most sacred temple, the Akur.
Which is the ancient equivalent of destroying the supreme manager's office. You do not touch the Akur. The myth states that Enlil was so deeply enraged by this act of ultimate disrespect that he actively cursed the entire Akkadian Empire.
To execute his wrath, Enlil summoned a barbaric, fierce mountain people called the Guchians to sweep down from the Zagros Mountains, sack the cities, disrupt the trade routes, and bring famine and total collapse to Akkad.
This pervasive fear of sudden, catastrophic cosmic collapse is woven into all their myths. They constantly worried that the machinery of the universe was fragile. Think about the myth of the Anzu bird.
Oh, the Anzu bird. The Anzu is this monstrous, massive chaos demon bird. And one day, according to the myth, while the supreme god Enlil is taking a bath, the Anzu bird swoops down into the throne room and steals a sacred object called the Tablet of Destinies.
The Tablet of Destinies is a fascinating theological concept. It was believed to be the actual physical clay tablet upon which the supreme, unalterable decrees of the gods were written. It contained the literal fate and function of the entire universe.
I love comparing the Tablet of Destinies to the universe's master source code. If you possess that tablet, you have root access to the cosmos. You control reality itself.
So when the Anzu bird steals it, the entire universe starts glitching. Time stops, the divine laws break down, the rivers stop flowing.
It takes the warrior god Ninurta fighting an epic, universe-shaking battle against the bird to get the tablet back and restore the source code. The story perfectly illustrates how incredibly fragile they believed their political and cosmic stability truly was. One mistake, one stolen tablet, one angered god, and the entire system falls apart.
We also see this theme of human ambition overstepping its bounds, threatening that fragile order in the myth of Etana. Etana was a mythical early king of the city of Kish who desperately needed an heir to secure his dynasty.
He finds an injured, starving eagle in a pit, nurses it back to health, and the eagle, in gratitude, agrees to fly Etana all the way up to heaven to beg the high gods for the magical plant of birth.
The imagery in that myth is amazing. Etana is clinging for his life to the eagle's chest, soaring higher and higher. The myth describes him looking down as the earth gets smaller and smaller until it looks like a woven basket, and then like a tiny ditch, and then vanishes entirely.
But the higher he gets, the more terrified he becomes of being in a realm where humans do not belong. He loses his nerve, he cries out to the eagle to stop, and they plummet dizzyingly back to Earth.
It's a beautifully blurry line between a historical king trying to secure political stability and a cautionary, terrifying myth about the inherent dangers of human ambition reaching too close to the gods.
But this all makes me want to ask you about the reality behind these stories. Were stories like Naram-Sin's divine curse or Etana's fall actually just ancient political spin?
It's highly likely.
Think about it logically. If you are a later ruler, maybe from a new city-state, trying to legitimize your own new dynasty, what better way to explain away the previous administration's catastrophic failures than by blaming it entirely on supernatural anger?
It's much easier to tell the peasants, hey, it wasn't a failure of supply chain logistics or taxation policy, guys. Naram-Sin just made Enlil mad, so the gods sent the barbarians.
It is the ultimate political deflection. You blame the gods for your geopolitical failures.
It is entirely plausible, and frankly highly probable, that these myths were weaponized by the priesthood and later kings as political propaganda to legitimize the shifting of power and explain away administrative incompetence.
But the reality is that Naram-Sin's political troubles, whether they were caused by his own hubris or just bad logistics, were absolutely nothing compared to the apocalyptic, terrifying wrath that the actual physical environment was about to unleash on Sumer.
Which brings us to the tragic, prolonged final act. We spent this entire deep dive talking about how the Sumerians used brilliant engineering to survive and master their harsh environment. Now we have to talk about how the environment finally fought back and won.
Around 2200 BC, the entire Middle East was hit by a massive climatic shift that modern climatologists call the 4.2 kiloyear event. This is not just a couple of bad harvests.
This was a period of severe, abrupt, and prolonged climate change. It was a staggering mega drought that lasted for over a century. Rainfall patterns shifted, the snowmelt in the Taurus Mountains severely decreased, and the water levels in the Tigris and Euphrates absolutely plummeted.
For an empire that relied entirely on massive, water-intensive agricultural surpluses to feed hundreds of thousands of people packed into dense cities, a century-long mega-drought is a slow-motion death sentence. The canals start running dry.
And to make things even more apocalyptic and terrifying, right around 2213 BC, right as this devastating drought is kicking in and society is fracturing under the famine, a spectacular, terrifying comet appears in the sky.
We know it today from astronomical records as the Hale-Bopp comet. Imagine being a Sumerian farmer. Your fields are cracking and turning to dust, your children are literally starving to death in the streets, and suddenly this massive glowing streak of light appears, dominating the night sky for weeks.
It must have felt like the ultimate omen that the gods had truly and finally abandoned them.
And into this weakened, starving, terrified, and politically fractured state came the invaders. The drought didn't just affect Sumer, it affected the surrounding regions too, driving desperate people toward the rivers.
We mentioned the Garchians earlier, the mountain tribes from the Zagros. The Sumerian texts refer to them with absolute visceral venom. They call them a people who know no rules, who have human instincts but the intelligence of feral dogs.
The Garchians swept down from the mountains, taking advantage of the Akkadian Empire's weakness, and ravaged the cities. And from the west came another nomadic group, the Amorites, pressing hard against the borders, desperately looking for water and grazing land for their flocks.
But Sumer wasn't completely dead yet. They are incredibly resilient. They actually had one last brilliant gasp of glory. After a dark century of Gusian disruption, a Sumerian king named Utu-Hengal managed to rally the armies and drive the Gusians out.
And his successor, a king named Ur-Nammu, sparked what historians call the Neo-Sumerian revival.
Ur-Nammu was a brilliant, energetic administrator. He tried to restore the old order. He established the first known written law code in human history centuries before Hammurabi's famous code.
He tried to standardize weights and measures to fix the economy, and he was a massive, ambitious builder. He commanded the construction of the Great Ziggurat of Ur, this staggering, multi-tiered, mountain-like temple complex dedicated to the moon god Nana.
It was a massive, defiant statement of Sumerian resilience built right in the face of collapse.
But while Ur-Nammu is building his towering ziggurats and his scribes are writing out his new laws, there is a silent, insidious, unstoppable killer lurking in the very mud they are building with. The ultimate tragedy of Sumer, the thing that finally broke them, is soil salinization.
This is the crux of their environmental collapse. And it is a tragedy of chemistry. To survive in the desert, they had to irrigate. They had to flood their fields with river water.
But the water from the Tigris and Euphrates, flowing over thousands of miles of rock, contains microscopic, trace amounts of dissolved salts. When the Sumerians flooded their fields, the brutal, relentless Mesopotamian sun would evaporate that standing water almost instantly.
When the water turns to vapor, it leaves those microscopic salt crystals behind in the topsoil.
Over a few years, it's not a problem. But over decades and then centuries of constant, intensive irrigation, that salt built up through capillary action.
The soil literally started turning white, a toxic crust forming over the once fertile brown mud. Wheat, which was their primary staple crop and the foundational source of their economic wealth, is highly sensitive to salt in the soil.
As the salt levels rose, it choked the wheat roots, preventing them from absorbing water through osmotic pressure. The wheat yields collapsed. The Sumerians were incredibly observant. They noticed this happening, and they tried to adapt by shifting their crop production away from high-value wheat and relying heavily on barley, because barley has a much higher tolerance for soil salinity.
But it was a losing battle. Eventually, the salt concentration in the soil becomes so highly toxic that even the resilient barley cannot grow. They tried everything. They practiced intense crop rotation. They tried leaving massive tracts of fields fallow to recover. They dug deeper drainage trenches.
But it wasn't enough. You cannot negotiate with basic chemistry. The land was poisoned.
So what does this all mean? I look at this entire history, and it is just devastating. It is a slow-ticking environmental time bomb that they built themselves.
I look at this civilization. They were smart enough to invent mathematics. They invented written laws. They charted the movements of the stars. They built architecture that still stands today.
But they couldn't see, or couldn't stop, the fact that the very technology that allowed them to build their empire in the first place, the brilliant, life-giving irrigation, was slowly, mathematically salting their own earth to death.
I have to wonder, could any amount of prayer to Enki, could any amount of brilliant bureaucratic adaptation have saved them from the inevitable consequences of their own success? Or was their total collapse baked into the very blueprint of their civilization from the moment they dug that first canal?
It is the ultimate heartbreaking, tragic irony. Their greatest, most vital innovation was the exact mechanism of their doom. They engineered their way to greatness, and they engineered their own extinction.
And once the food supply completely failed, the final political collapse was remarkably swift. By 2028 BC, the last king of the unified Neo-Sumerian state, a man named Ibisen of Ur, is hopelessly trapped.
The crops have completely failed. The Amorites have breached the northern defensive walls and are raiding the starving countryside.
In a desperate, final move, Ibisen gathers a massive fortune in temple silver, gives it to his most trusted official, a man named Ishbi-Era, and sends him north on a desperate mission to buy whatever grain he can find at extortionate prices.
And Ishbi-Era takes the silver, travels north, secures the grain, and then completely betrays his king. Seeing that Ur is doomed, Ishbi-Era uses those resources to essentially declare independence, pay off mercenaries, and set up his own rival kingdom in the city of Isen,
leaving his king, Ibisen, to starve behind the walls of Ur.
The internal betrayal sealed their fate, but the final fatal blow came from the east. The Elamites, longtime geopolitical rivals from the mountains of modern-day Iran, saw that the great city of Ur was starving, politically fractured and undefended.
They marched their armies in, laid siege to the city, breached the walls, sacked it with unimaginable brutality, burned the grand temples to the ground, and dragged the last Sumerian king, Ibisen, away in chains.
It was the definitive, violent, absolute end of Sumer as an independent political entity. They would never rise again.
And you can feel the absolute crushing despair of this moment echoing backward into their mythology. Because their physical land had literally turned to toxic white dust, their vision of the afterlife was incredibly grim.
Unlike the Egyptians, who hoped their good deeds would earn them a place in a sunny, abundant field of reeds, the Sumerians believed that absolutely everyone, kings, beggars, and priests alike, went to the same terrifying underworld.
This underworld was ruled by the fearsome goddess Ereshkigal and her husband Nergal, the god of death and plague.
The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a terrifying, vivid description of this underworld, a vision dreamed by Enkidu before he dies. It is called the House of Dust.
It is described as a place where the dead sit for eternity in absolute suffocating darkness. They are clothed in feathers like birds, fluttering blindly, and the most chilling detail of all, reflecting their poisoned land. The text says, "Dust is their fare and clay their food."
They built their entire magnificent civilization out of the mud and clay, and they believed with horrifying finality that they would spend eternity eating it in the dark.
The absolute bleakness of death in their worldview is just crushing. When the city of Ur finally fell to the Elamites, the starving, traumatized survivors wrote these agonizingly beautiful poems to process the horror.
The Lament for Ur is one of the most heartbreaking pieces of literature ever written by human hands. It vividly describes the blood pooling in the streets, the bodies of the unburied rotting in the scorching sun, and the utter, terrifying shock that the gods had simply packed up and abandoned their temples.
They write about how Enlil called the storm of destruction and then turned his back. They simply couldn't believe Enlil had let his magnificent city die.
The Lament for Ur perfectly captures the trauma of a people realizing that their fundamental divine contract was broken. They had worked the land, they had built the temples, they had fed the gods, and yet the gods had let the city burn anyway. Their entire conceptual world had ended.
Let's pull back and recap this incredible, tragic arc. The Sumerians were the ultimate human pioneers. They walked into a muddy, unpredictable, scorching, resource-starved wasteland, and through sheer force of will, terrifyingly hard work, and brilliant engineering, they turned it into the literal blueprint for human civilization.
They invented the wheel, the plow, complex mathematics, and the profound miracle of writing. They created a complex, terrifying theology that gave their immense suffering meaning and purpose. They built the first massive cities, and they built the first empires.
And yet, they were ultimately undone by the harsh environmental limits of their own brilliant innovations. The intensive irrigation that fed their millions also slowly poisoned their earth with salt.
The massive walled cities that protected them from the chaos of nature also bred severe social inequality, tyranny, and devastating mechanized warfare. They solved the problems of nature, only to fall victim to the problems of civilization.
You know, it is so easy to sit here in the modern world, look at a cracked 4,000-year-old clay tablet in a museum case, and think of these ancient Sumerians as fundamentally alien to us.
But they're not.
Not at all. When you really look at their story, their struggles are intimately, uncomfortably ours today. We are currently trying to balance rapid, runaway technological advancement, like the AI we compared them to earlier, with the desperate existential need to mitigate massive, potentially catastrophic environmental changes.
We are still navigating crushing social inequality in our own megacities, and we are still fundamentally just a species searching for meaning and order in a universe that often feels like Namu's random, chaotic saltwater.
The parallels are undeniable and sobering. We possess vastly superior technology, but we're still grappling with the exact same variables of human nature and environmental limitation that they first encountered in the mud between the rivers all those millennia ago.
So true.
So I want to leave you, listening right now, with a final provocative thought to mull over. The Sumerian Empire politically collapsed. Their massive mud brick cities eventually eroded and turned back into the desert sand that Pietro della Vega found in 1625.
But their language, Sumerian, did not immediately die. It survived for another 2,000 years, painstakingly preserved by the later Babylonians and the Assyrians, purely as a sacred, scholarly, and magical tongue, very much like how Latin was used by priests and scholars in medieval Europe long after the fall of Rome.
So think about this. If our modern, highly complex, globalized civilization were to slowly crumble into the dust tomorrow due to our own environmental hubris, what single piece of our modern culture, our technology, or our language do you think future humans would painstakingly preserve as a sacred relic thousands of years from now?
What is our cuneiform?
Exactly. What will they dig up out of our ashes and try to decipher? Keep that in the back of your mind. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.